Right. So the next speaker is Changchen from Monash. So he will present the inflationary impact of government spending shocks. Do funding choices matter? So, Changchen, you have 20 minutes, and the floor is yours. Thank you. Hello, Changchen, can you hear me?
Okay, so my paper is about the inflationary impact of government spending shocks. Do funding choices matter? So this paper is joined with Giovanni Caggiano, Thomas Mosley, and Xuan Zhou. Since Xuan is working in the Reserve Bank of Australia, the Euro claim must apply. So in the aftermath of the COVID-19, the fiscal policy has been widely used to avert an economic downturn comparable to the Great Recession. However, we see resurgence of global inflation and the deterioration of the public budget balance have renewed academic interest in relationship between the spending and the inflation. So a growing body of research has been released on the fiscal theory of price levels, including the influential contributions by Barrow and Bianchi and Smet and Utters. So I just give a clear image how we motivate this paper. So if you look at the dynamics of the inflation and the monetary policy since the period after COVID. So here you see the monetary policy basically stay at a zero lower bound, but there is a suddenly bursting inflation. So there is nothing changed on the monetary policy, but where does the inflation come from? So with eyeballing, you will see there is a large increase in the government debt then held by the public that might trigger the inflation. So according to the literature, the conventional theories often predicts that an increase in the government will lead to an inflation. However, there is no consensus regarding the sign of the estimated price level response to the fiscal expansion. So that is a stark difference from the conventional theory prediction. So the existing studies actually fall into two stark conclusions. First, for paper like Prodi 2005 and Kadar and Kemp 2017, they tend to conclude that the government spending will lead to a flat response in the price level or a negative response in inflation. However, in the other strand of literature, the paper from Banzaev and Papa 2017 and Ferrara, they tend to say the government spending will increase the price level response. So this paper's contribution mainly rely on by proposing a new proxy for government spending shocks. So we can provide a new evidence when the inflationary effects of the government spending rely on household expectations of future taxes. So the main research questions of the paper is as follows. So we asked, do the funding choices matter for the impact of government spending shocks for inflation? So the main idea in this paper is we propose a new proxy on the government spending shocks based on the military news shock by Ramy and Zubri. So we disentangle the spending shocks based on the spread between the treasury bond and the municipal bond to separate the government spending into two categories. So at the time of the announcement, at the time of the government news announcement, if it's expected to be matched by a future tax increase, we will classify the government spending shocks as funded. So if at the time of the government news announcement, if it is not expected to be followed by a future tax increase, we will classify the government spending shocks as unfunded. Then we use these proxies as an instrument for structural government spending shocks to estimate the effects on inflation from the period in between 1960 quarter one to 2015 quarter four. So here's the main result of our paper. So when the household are expected the government spending to be financed, The government spending shock tends to reduce the inflation in the short run. Since the intertemporal budget constraint is satisfied, the inflation expectation remain well anchored. So the impulse response of the tax revenues often fits our ante expectations. There is a rise in tax revenue in the midterm, and also we see with the funded shocks, we see a lower projected and stable debt path. So for the unfunded government spending shocks, we see the inflation is actually increased on the impact, with also the inflation expectation rise within the first year. And on the other side, we see the tax revenues fall significantly, and the response of that rise significantly for the next 5 years. So which shows our result is basically consistent with the fiscal theory of price level that is currently circulated in the macroeconomic literature. So here's the main, yes.
Sorry, Changchen, just to understand a bit, because I mean, for the two mechanism, funding mechanism, I'm not, I'm not a macroeconomist, I'm an econometrician, but I'm trying to understand. Do you connect this like to supply and demand? Because for me, I think this is like what, maybe one of the key elements for inflation to rise, or so you see what I mean? I don't get the point of what's the mechanism behind like different impacts of funded or unfunded mechanism on the inflation.
So in our paper, we did not disentangle the government spending shocks between the supply and demand shocks. So we classify our spending shocks based on how the households are expected the future tax change to change. So
right, okay, I got the point now. I got the point. Yeah.
So it is really on how the households expected the future primary surplus to change. So will the government announce a tax increase in the next 2 years, or will the government keep the tax unchanged and announce a tax cut? So that's the hook of our instrument.
You hurt the pockets of customers, right? So
yeah.
The tax. Yeah, thank you.
So our main takeaway of this paper is our results is in line with the prediction of the fiscal theory of the price level. So when the intertemporal budget constraint is satisfied, the government spending shocks do not raise any inflation. On the other side, if the government spending shocks is funded by the debt, it will trigger the inflationary effects and increase in the government debt. And more importantly, we found out the inflation effects of the unfunded government spending is primarily operated through a fiscal backing channel rather than a demand channel that conventionally talking in the macroeconomics. So next, let me talk about how we classify the instrument. So we use a spread between the municipal bond and the treasury bond to proxy the forward-looking implied tax rate for the household. So the formula is given as follows. So it's 1 minus the spread between the municipal bond and the treasury bond. Since the municipal bond is tax exemptable and the treasury bond is taxable, we assuming that the household is indifferent between holding a municipal bond and holding a taxable bond. So the spread between these two bonds can be proxied as a implied tax rate for the next 3 or 5 years. Okay, so when we have the implied tax rate, then we match the change of the implied tax rate at the quarter when the government defense spending news is announced. So if we see an increase in the change in the implied tax rate, it means the household will anticipate a future tax hikes. We will classify the spending shock as funded. So if the changing implied tax rate is negative, we'll see the household does not anticipate a future tax hikes. They will instead anticipate a steady tax rates or cutting taxes in the future. Then we classify the shock as unfunded. So here is a general series how we classify the defense spending news they announced in the Raimi series. So the blue ones represent those spending shocks that are funded. Then the red ones represent the spending shocks that are unfunded. Due to the time limit, I'm not going to discuss this in detail. Then I'll move on to the SVAR model. So we use a very simple VAR model with 4 lags and a constant. So the sample period of our paper are from 1960 Q1 to 2015 Q4. So that is a time where the inflation expectation is available. So we use a classical decomposition by ordering the instrument and order the instrument first in the VAR. So it equivalent to treat the government spending news as an internal instrument for real government spending. So currently we have 9 variables in the VAR, which is the real government spending, real tax revenue, real output, the debt to GDP ratio. So we also have the forward-looking variables, which is the 1 year ahead inflation expectations from the Michigan Survey of Consumers. Here we use the GDP deflator as a measure of inflation. So in the robustness check, we also try the CPI index and the PCE index. We get nearly the same results. For the interest rate, we're using the 90-day Treasury bill rate, and we also have the consumer sentiment in the VAR to capture any news that they related to the future monetary and fiscal announcement. So for the impulse response functions I show in the next slide, the shock is normalized as a 1% increase in the government spending, and the confidence interval is a 68% confidence interval. So we start with the benchmark as a unclassified spending shocks, where we use the original Ramey series as the instrument for the government spending. So here you will see a muted response of tax revenue, also a muted response of the output. The debt remains significant for the first 4 years, and it increased about 2% after five years after the shock. So you will also see there's a muted response of the inflation expectations, also a slightly increasing inflation of 0.5% on impact. Given that the output is slightly contractionary in the first term, so with the Ramey shock, you will see the monetary policy is accommodate to stabilize the output movement by decreasing by 1% after 2 quarters. So in the next slides, I'm going to show you how different is our response based on the expectation of the tax changes. So here are the main results of the paper. So the blue line actually shows the response of the funded government spending, where the households expected the future tax to increase, where the red line shows the response of the unfunded government spending, where the household does not expect the tax to increase. So for the time limit, I will show you 3 important results in our paper. First, when the government spending is funded, you'll see yes.
5 minutes, around 5 minutes.
Yeah. So you will see an increase in tax revenues between the 4th quarter and the 8th quarter. So that matches our expectations ex ante with the funded government spending shocks. And here you will also see with the funded government spending shocks, the path of the debt remains stable for the next 5 years. Then given the stable path of the debt to GDP ratios, the inflation expectation remain well anchored. So there is no significant movement in inflation, and the interest rate remains stable for the next 5 years. However, for the unfunded government spending shocks, here you won't see any increase in the tax revenues, but on the other side, you will see a significant increase in the debt to GDP ratios, around 10% after 5 years. Here I want to say, when we use the level of the debt to perform the same analysis, we also see an increase in the debt. So that increasing the debt to GDP ratio is not a result of the decreasing output here. So with the accumulated debt increasing in the economy, the household will increase their inflation expectations by raising their inflation expectations of 1.5% in the first year, which directly lead to a sharp increase in the inflation about 2% in the first year. So this is where our main conclusion come from is it's actually the accumulation of the debt that leads to the sharp inflation in the short run. So this is where we get the fiscal then we will get the inclusion of the fiscal theory. Our result is consistent with the fiscal theory of price level. So next thing I want to show you the response of the consumption and investment. Same here, you will see the blue line represented the funded shock response of the funded shocks. The red line represent the response of the unfunded shocks. Here, when you see when the household expect the government to increase its taxes by finance their government spending, the household will anticipate the future tax hike by reducing their consumptions in the first year. However, with the unfunded government spending shocks, they directly to give a income effect to the household and companies, which lead to a initial boost in consumption and investment in the short run and on the impact. So let me wrap it. So okay, how many minutes I have?
2 minutes.
Oh, okay, let me wrap up. Okay, so in this paper, we use the spread between the treasury bond and the municipal bond to construct a implied forward tax rate from Lipper and Walker and Young to classify the defense spending shocks into two categories. One is the funded government spending, one is the unfunded government spending. We show that our results are in line with the prediction of the fiscal theory of the price level, where the funded shocks do not raise any inflation in the next 5 years. However, the unfunded shocks trigger a significant inflationary effects on impact, and they lead to an increase in the government debt. And we also show that the inflation effects of the unfunded government spending primarily operates through a fiscal backing channel rather than an aggregate demand channel in the macroeconomic literature. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Changchen. So any question or from the audience? Right. If not, then we're gonna move to the next session. So I will leave my colleague Adriana to share the next session on methodology. Thank you very much.